He laughed at me. "Look how you walk, like you were assembled from spare parts." I started hiding my hands in my pockets. And then he fell, and I was the first one to lift him up. Growing up, I always knew something was different about the way I moved. My shoulders never quite lined up the way they should, one always sitting a little higher than the other. My spine curved in ways that made my whole body look slightly askew, like a building that had settled unevenly over time. But I didn't really think about it much until my brother started pointing it out. He was 3 years older than me, and like most older brothers, he had this special talent for finding exactly the thing that would get under your skin and then pressing on it until you wanted to disappear into the floor. With me, it was my posture, my walk, the way I carried myself through the world, like I was constantly trying to fold myself into something smaller. The first time he really went after it, we were walking to school together. I was maybe 12, still at that age where you desperately want to blend in with everyone else, but somehow always manage to stick out instead. We were about halfway there when he suddenly stopped walking and started doing this exaggerated impression of me. His shoulders hunched up, one higher than the other, his arms swinging awkwardly at his sides, his whole body moving in this jerky, unnatural way. "Look," he said to his friend who lived down the street and always walked with us, "watch this. This is how my brother walks." Then he did it again, making his movements even more pronounced, more ridiculous. It's like watching a broken robot trying to figure out how legs work. His friend laughed, and I felt something hot and sharp twist in my chest. But I laughed too, because what else was I supposed to do? If I got upset, if I showed that it bothered me, that would just give him more ammunition. So I laughed along, like we were all in on the same joke, even though the joke was me. That became his thing after that. Whenever we were around other people, whenever he wanted to get a laugh, he'd start doing his impression of my walk. He'd hunch his shoulders and move his arms in that strange, disconnected way, and everyone would crack up. He came up with names for it too. Sometimes I was the broken Terminator, sometimes I was a malfunctioning android, but his favorite was calling it my cockroach walk. "Here comes the cockroach," he'd say when I walked into a room, scuttling along like something you'd find under the kitchen sink. The worst part wasn't even the teasing itself. It was how self-conscious it made me about every single movement I made. Before he started this whole thing, I just moved through the world without thinking about it. Sure, my posture wasn't perfect, but it was just how I was. After he started pointing it out, though, I became hyper-aware of every step, every gesture, every time I shifted my weight from one foot to the other. I started trying to fix it, to walk more normally, but that just made things worse. When you're concentrating that hard on something that should be automatic, everything becomes stilted and awkward. I'd focus so hard on keeping my shoulders level that I'd forget to move my arms naturally. I'd try to make my stride more even and end up walking like I was marching in some bizarre parade. So I gave up trying to fix it and instead started trying to hide it. I kept my hands shoved deep in my pockets whenever possible, thinking that would somehow make the rest of it less noticeable. I started walking closer to walls, staying on the edges of groups, doing whatever I could to minimize how much of me was visible to other people. School became this constant exercise in trying to be invisible. I'd time my movements between classes so I could walk through the hallways when they were less crowded. I'd sit in the back of classrooms, slouch down in my chair, hoping nobody would notice the weird angle of my shoulders. During gym class, which was basically torture, I tried to position myself where the strange way I moved would be less obvious. But my brother had this talent for making sure I could never quite escape it. He'd bring it up at family dinners, making jokes about how I moved like I was powered by a glitchy operating system. He'd do his impression for relatives who came to visit, turning my body into entertainment for everyone else. And the terrible thing was, they all laughed. Not in a mean way, necessarily, but they laughed, and each laugh felt like confirmation that yes, there really was something fundamentally wrong with the way I existed in the world. The thing about being teased like that, especially by someone in your own family, is that it becomes this constant background noise in your head. Even when he wasn't around, even when nobody was making jokes about the way I moved, I could still hear his voice pointing out everything that was wrong with me. I'd catch a glimpse of myself in a store window and immediately think about how strange I looked, how obvious it must be to everyone around me that I didn't quite fit together right. I started avoiding mirrors when I could, and when I couldn't avoid them, I'd only look at my face, never at my whole body. I stopped participating in activities where I'd have to move around a lot in front of other people. I turned down invitations to go places where I'd be walking around with groups of friends, afraid that someone else would notice what my brother had been pointing out all along. Update 1. High school was when things really got complicated. My brother had moved on to other interests by then, mostly girls, and trying to convince our parents he was responsible enough to borrow the car on weekends. The constant commentary about my walk had mostly stopped, but the damage was already done. I'd internalized all of it, turned it into this permanent voice in my head that evaluated every movement I made. But high school also brought new challenges. There were school dances, social events, situations where you couldn't just hug the walls and hope nobody noticed you. And there were girls, which added a whole new layer of self-consciousness to everything. How do you ask someone to dance when you're convinced that the way you move across a room makes you look like some kind of malfunctioning machine? I found ways to cope, mostly by developing what I thought of as strategic positioning. I became really good at finding spots where I could stand or sit that minimized how much of my awkward movement other people would see. I learned to time my entrances and exits from rooms. I got skilled at redirecting conversations away from anything that might lead to physical activity. But the strangest things started happening around this time. Other people began commenting on my walk, but not in the way I expected. A few different people, completely unprompted, mentioned that I had this interesting way of moving, that there was something distinctive about my stride. They weren't making fun of it, though. They were just noticing it, the way you might notice that someone has particularly expressive eyes or an unusual laugh. One girl I had a crush on mentioned that she always knew it was me walking down the hallway before she even turned around, because I had this recognizable rhythm to my steps. She said it like it was a good thing, like it was just part of what made me who I was. It was the first time anyone had ever talked about the way I moved without making it sound like something that needed to be fixed or hidden. This threw me completely off balance, mentally speaking. I'd spent so many years thinking of my posture and my walk as this shameful secret, this obvious flaw that everyone could see and judge. The idea that it might just be a neutral characteristic, or even something that made me memorable in a positive way, was almost impossible to process. I started paying attention to how other people moved, really watching them for the first time instead of just being hyper-aware of my own movements. And what I noticed was that everybody moved differently. Everybody had their own rhythm, their own way of carrying themselves through space. Some people bounced when they walked, some people glided, some people took quick short steps, others had long lazy strides. My way of moving wasn't actually that strange in the context of all the different ways human bodies could move through the world. But by then, the self-consciousness had become such a deeply ingrained habit that I couldn't just switch it off. Even when I intellectually understood that my walk wasn't this horrible thing that made me a walking punchline, I still felt that familiar twist of anxiety every time I had to cross a room where people might be watching. My brother and I had settled into a different kind of relationship by this point. We were both getting older, both dealing with our own stuff. He was stressed about college applications and trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. I was dealing with all the usual high school drama, plus my own college worries. The dynamic between us had shifted from him being the older brother who picked on me to both of us being almost adults trying to navigate our own problems. He still made the occasional joke about my walk, but it felt more like habit than genuine mockery. Like he'd been doing it for so long that he didn't really think about whether it was funny anymore. It was just something he said. And I'd gotten so used to it that it barely registered most of the time. It was just background noise, part of the familiar rhythm of our family interactions. But I could tell he was starting to notice that the jokes didn't land the same way they used to. I wasn't laughing along anymore, wasn't playing my part in the routine. When he'd make some comment about my cockroach walk, I'd just shrug or ignore it completely. I think he was starting to realize that maybe the whole thing had run its course, that we were both too old for this particular game. Update 2. College changed everything. The way college changes everything for most people. Suddenly, I was in a completely new environment where nobody knew anything about my history, where I could reinvent myself however I wanted. I was surrounded by people who had never heard my brother's commentary about the way I moved, who had no preconceived notions about what my walk was supposed to mean. And the most amazing thing happened. Without the constant background noise of being teased about it, I started to forget to be self-conscious about it. Not completely, not all at once, but gradually. I'd catch myself walking across campus without thinking about how my shoulders were positioned, without trying to hide my hands in my pockets, without calculating the best route to minimize how much time I'd spend visible to other people. I made friends who accepted me exactly as I was, posture and all. I dated people who seemed to genuinely like the way I moved through the world. I started participating in activities that required me to be physical, to move around in front of other people, and slowly began to remember what it felt like to inhabit my body without constantly critiquing it. But the real breakthrough came during my sophomore year, when I was taking this theater class as an elective. We were doing movement exercises, and the instructor was talking about how every person has their own physical signature, their own way of expressing themselves through their body. She had us do this exercise where we had to exaggerate our natural movements, really lean into whatever made our way of moving distinctive. When it was my turn, I found myself doing something that looked a lot like my brother's old impression of me, but without the mockery. I hunched my shoulders, let my arms swing in that awkward way, moved with all the jerky energy that had been the source of so much embarrassment. But in the context of this exercise, surrounded by other people doing their own exaggerated movements, it didn't feel shameful. It felt expressive, like I was showing people something true about who I was. The instructor and the other students responded to it positively. They talked about how my movement had this interesting broken quality to it, but broken in an intentional way, like a piece of abstract art that's beautiful because of its asymmetry rather than in spite of it. Someone said I moved like I was carrying some invisible weight that nobody else could see, and they meant it as a compliment. That was the moment when I finally understood what all those people in high school had been trying to tell me. My walk wasn't a flaw that needed to be hidden or fixed. It was just part of how I existed in the world, part of what made me recognizable, part of my physical vocabulary. All those years of trying to make myself invisible had been based on the assumption that being noticed was inherently bad, when really the problem was just the context in which I was being noticed. I started experimenting with actually embracing the way I moved instead of fighting against it. I let my shoulders settle into their natural uneven position. I let my arms swing the way they wanted to swing. I stopped trying to force my stride into some imaginary template of how walking was supposed to look. And the strangest thing was, the more I accepted my natural way of moving, the more confident I became overall. People responded to that confidence. They were drawn to someone who seemed comfortable in their own skin, even if that skin didn't fit together in the most conventional way. I started to understand that what people found attractive wasn't perfect posture or textbook body mechanics, but authenticity, the sense that someone was genuinely themselves rather than trying to be a version of themselves that they thought other people wanted to see. By the time I graduated, I had completely rewritten my relationship with my own body. I still moved the same way I always had, but now it felt like a choice rather than a burden. I could walk into a room full of strangers without calculating how to minimize my visibility. I could dance at parties without worrying that people were secretly laughing at me. I could exist in my body without constantly apologizing for taking up space in the world. But I hadn't seen my brother much during those college years. We'd talk on the phone occasionally, exchange messages on social media, see each other briefly during holidays. Our relationship had evolved into something more distant, but also more peaceful. We were both adults now, both building our own lives, both too busy with our own stuff to fall back into those old patterns of interaction. Final update. The family reunion happened about 6 months after I graduated. My parents decided to throw this big party to celebrate both my graduation and my brother's recent promotion at work. They rented out this community center, invited all our relatives, turned it into this whole production. It was the first time in years that our entire extended family would be in the same place at the same time. I was actually looking forward to it. I wanted to see everyone, wanted to show off this new version of myself that I developed over the past few years. I felt confident, comfortable in my own skin in a way that I'd never felt during all those family gatherings when I was younger. I was curious to see how people would react to this change in me, whether they'd notice that I carried myself differently now. My brother and I ended up arriving at the same time, parking our cars next to each other in the community center lot. It was strange seeing him after so long. He looked older, more serious, like he was carrying the weight of adult responsibilities in a way that was new for him. We hugged briefly, made small talk about our drive there, fell into that familiar sibling rhythm of interaction. The party was everything my parents had planned it to be. There were tons of people, tons of food. That particular kind of controlled chaos that happens when you get a large family together in one space. I found myself moving through the crowd with ease, talking to relatives I hadn't seen in years, genuinely enjoying myself in a way that would have been impossible for the younger version of me. And my brother was doing his thing too, working the room, charming everyone with stories about his job and his apartment and all the adult milestones he'd been hitting. We orbited around each other throughout the evening, occasionally ending up in the same conversation, but mostly doing our own things. But I could tell he was watching me sometimes. Not in a mean way, not like he was looking for something to make fun of. More like he was trying to figure out what was different about me, why I seemed so much more comfortable than I used to be at these kinds of events. A few times I caught him looking confused, like he was seeing something that didn't match his expectations. The community center had this big staircase leading up to a second-floor area where they'd set up some additional seating. People were going up and down all evening, and the steps were getting a little slippery from people tracking in moisture from outside. I'd noticed it earlier and had been being extra careful when I used the stairs. It was getting late in the evening when it happened. The party was winding down. People were starting to say their goodbyes and collect their coats. My brother was coming down the staircase, probably heading to the bathroom or maybe just wandering around like people do at the end of parties when they're not quite ready to leave yet. I was standing at the bottom of the stairs talking to our cousin about something completely unrelated when I heard this sound. This combination of a startled exclamation and the terrible noise of someone losing their footing. I looked up just in time to see my brother miss a step about halfway down the staircase. It wasn't a dramatic fall, not like something you'd see in a movie. He just slipped, his foot sliding out from under him, and then he was sitting hard on the stairs with his legs stretched out in front of him, and this look of complete surprise on his face. Not hurt, just shocked and embarrassed. The whole room seemed to freeze for a second. Everyone had heard the noise. Everyone was looking up at the staircase. Everyone was processing what had just happened. There was this moment of collective held breath, that universal pause that happens when someone falls and everyone's trying to figure out how serious it is. But I didn't pause. Without even thinking about it, I was moving toward the stairs. Not hurrying exactly. Not making a big dramatic rush, just walking over there in my own distinctive way, with my uneven shoulders and my arms swinging awkwardly at my sides, crossing the room to where my brother was sitting on the steps looking stunned. I climbed up a few steps until I was close enough to offer him my hand. He looked up at me, and I could see him taking in the whole situation. Him sitting there having just fallen down the stairs, me standing over him offering to help him up, the entire family watching this interaction play out. There was something in his expression that I'd never seen before. Not embarrassment, exactly, though there was some of that. Not gratitude, though there was some of that too. It was more like recognition, like he was seeing something clearly for the first time. He took my hand, and I helped pull him to his feet. He brushed off his pants, checked to make sure he wasn't hurt, nodded to everyone who was asking if he was okay. The moment passed. The party resumed its winding down rhythm. People went back to their conversations and their goodbyes. But then, just as I was about to head back to where I'd been standing, he said it, quietly, so that only I could hear him over the general noise of the party. "You still walk like a cockroach." For just a second, I felt that familiar twist in my chest, that old conditioned response to his teasing. But then I really looked at his face, and I could see that something was different. There was no mockery in his voice, no edge of superiority. He was just stating a fact, the way you might observe that someone has brown eyes or wears glasses. And that's when I understood what had just happened. All those years ago, when he'd started teasing me about the way I moved, it had been about power. He was the older brother, I was the younger one, and making fun of my walk was his way of establishing that hierarchy. But now, after he'd just fallen down the stairs in front of our entire family, after I'd been the one to help him up, that power dynamic had completely shifted. I wasn't the awkward little brother anymore, the one who needed to be put in his place. I was just his brother, someone who moved through the world in his own particular way, someone who'd been there when he needed help. And he wasn't the superior older sibling anymore either. He was just another person trying to navigate through life without falling down, sometimes literally. So I looked at him, this person who'd shaped so much of how I thought about myself for so many years, and I said the thing that came naturally. "Yeah, but cockroaches don't fall downstairs." And he laughed, really laughed, not the performative laugh he used to do when he was showing off for other people, but genuine amusement. Like he'd just gotten a joke that he'd been missing for years. We stood there for a moment, two adults who'd grown up together, who'd hurt each other and helped each other in all the messy ways that siblings do. And I realized that this was probably the first completely honest interaction we'd had about my walk since the whole thing started. No cruelty, no shame, no trying to hide or fix anything. Just acknowledgement of how things were, and maybe even some appreciation for it. The rest of the evening was different after that. We ended up staying later than we'd planned, sitting in a corner talking about things we'd never talked about before. He told me that he'd always felt like he had to be perfect, had to be the successful older brother, and that making fun of me had been his way of dealing with his own insecurities. I told him about college, about learning to accept the way I moved, about how his teasing had affected me, but also how it had eventually led me to understand myself better. We didn't solve everything that night. Years of complicated sibling dynamics don't just disappear because of one conversation. But something fundamental had shifted between us. The power struggle was over. We could just be brothers now. Two people who cared about each other despite all the ways we'd managed to hurt each other over the years. When we finally left the community center, we walked out to the parking lot together. And as we were saying goodbye, getting ready to drive back to our separate lives, he said something that I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. You know, I never told you this, but I always thought your walk was kind of cool. Like you were moving to music that nobody else could hear. I looked at him, this person who'd been both my biggest tormentor and my closest family member, who'd made me ashamed of my body and who'd also been there for every important moment of my childhood, and I realized that we'd both finally grown up enough to see each other clearly. I got in my car and drove home, moving through the world the same way I always had, but carrying it all differently now. The way I walked wasn't my shame anymore, wasn't my secret, wasn't something I needed to hide or fix or apologize for. It was just part of who I was, part of how I moved through my life, part of what made me recognizable to the people who cared enough to notice. And sometimes, when I'm walking down a hallway or across a parking lot or through a crowded room, I think about that moment on the stairs, how I didn't hesitate to reach out my hand, how he didn't hesitate to take it, how we both finally understood that the way someone moves through the world isn't something to be mocked or fixed, but just something to be accepted as part of the complicated, beautiful business of being human.